right. Hey, good morning, everybody. Today is just an absolute fantastic day. Thank you and welcome to the Energy Newsbeat podcast. My name's Stu Turley, President and CEO of the Sandstone Group. We got a real treat for you today. I'd like to introduce Bobby Tudor, and he's got a pedigree. I mean, this is a fantastic interview we're about to have. Everybody's heard of Tudor, Pickering, and Holt. You're also a partner at Goldman Sachs. You're currently the chairman of the Houston Energy Transition, and then you're also on the board of trustees for the Houston Partnership of Rice University, board of advisors for Rice Baker Institute, and the Carbon Neutral Coalition. Man, you got some things going on. Thank you for stopping by. I am so thrilled to get to talk to you because, you know, the companies that you've worked in the past for are who's. What were you thinking when you started and worked as a co-founder of Tudor, Pickering, and Holt?
Well, I'd had a great 20-year run at Goldman Sachs, which is an amazing institution in and of itself with tons of talented people, and I was very lucky and worked in great places and did interesting things, but I wanted a second chapter professionally that was a little more entrepreneurial, not such a cog in a wheel, and decided that I thought there was a great opportunity to start an energy-focused investment bank that was a bit of a different beast, if you will, and so I ended up teaming up with Dan Pickering and Maynard Holt, and a group of other senior folks, Ali Pruner, Dave Purcell, Lance Gilliland, et cetera. And we built a very unique beast of an investment bank, TPH.
Yep.
And had a great 16-year run. So we merged it into a New York-based investment bank, Perella Weinberg Partners, about 5 years ago. And then Dan, Maynard, and I have all retired from that and are all off now doing new things, and so I'm now on the third chapter, I guess you'd call it.
But how exciting to have that vision. And when you're talking about an investment bank for energy, what were your main focuses there that made you successful?
Well, I think a few different things. One is we were lucky. So if being lucky is a focus, I was really focused on being lucky. And when I say being lucky, what I meant,
taking that note down.
our timing was good. We caught the front end of the shale revolution. We really started the business in February of 2007, and the shale revolution was kind of just gaining momentum. And my partner Dan Pickering had actually started a little energy boutique called Pickering Energy Partners a few years ago, and so we took that entity and decided we were going to build a broader investment banking and asset management platform around it, which is what we did. And we just got a little smarter on the shale business before our competitors did. We established credibility in the space. We attracted clients. We gave them good execution, and built a really good business around it. Then we grew it and expanded to new areas and new geographies, and had a really sort of technically oriented approach to investment banking, energy investment banking, which was a bit unusual at that time. It's now sort of the standard, if you will.
Yep.
But when we started with that, it was not so common, and that gave us a leg up as well. So we got lucky. We made some good decisions, had terrific people, built a good culture,
right,
and had a lot of fun doing it. So it was a terrific experience.
I keep hearing this theme with you, and I'm pretty excited about that. We had fun. That's really cool corporate environment that you were able to set there. So it's a little better than BlackRock right now when they lost $1 trillion this year.
No, but we never lost $1 trillion, but we never made $1 trillion either, I guess. Flip side of that. But we did build I think what was a unique and successful culture.
Right.
And what we said is we wanted to have an investment bank that was about more than just making money.
Right.
That it was really about working together in a way that was distinctive, so that our clients felt it and we felt it.
Right.
Felt like if we did that, people would have longer careers, they'd stay with it, they'd enjoy it. Look, investment banking can be a grind. You know, it's hard work. Your life is not your own. In some sense, it's sort of it's an avocation, not just a vocation.
Right.
You got to live it and breathe it and love it. And life's too short to have a job like that if it's not fun.
Right.
So we set out to make it fun, and I think we succeeded in that.
Isn't that great? I'll tell you, that is just really exciting. So as you got ready to finish up and you sold it, I mean, and then you went on to your next stage and everything. Did you start Artemis? Thank you. You started Artemis. Thank you. I went to Oklahoma State, and now I've got Texas license plate. So, you know, I'm confused. So Artemis, and you started Artemis.
It's called Artemis. And yeah, so we started Artemis. I started Artemis just early this year, sort of as I retired from my prior firm. And right now, our Artemis is just the name of the platform I'm using to make investments into the energy transition space and the energy space more broadly, as well as the work I'm doing for the Houston Energy Transition Initiative and other energy transition related activities. So it's just the kind of the name of the platform that I'm using. It's really just, you know, right now me and my assistant Erica Garrison and my son Harry. But we're doing some interesting, fun things, and we'll see how it evolves over time.
Fantastic. Now, you mentioned the Houston and also the Carbon Neutral Coalition. Yeah. Tell me what you're doing on the board with the Carbon Neutral Coalition, because that's a pretty interesting group. I've talked with Susan and Chuck, and great people.
Yeah, these are great people. So I think the brainchild here was really came from Corby Robertson. Corby's a very well-known Texas energy and person, and Corby, I think quite correctly, early on saw the need to get the sort of pieces in place to have a successful CCUS business in the state of Texas.
Right.
And it's a lot of pieces of the puzzle that you got to pull together to make that happen.
Right.
Some of it's economic, some of it's technical, but a lot of it is just policy and the law.
Oh, okay.
And so Corby recruited Susan and the rest of the team and a board of advisors, of which I'm a member, to help, you know, be an advocate for the CCUS business. And for getting in place all the pieces we need to get in place in Texas to really get us kind of up and running in it.
You know, what's really cool is the horsepower that you guys have is on the board. And when you're talking about CCUS or carbon capture, utilization, and storage, that's an important aspect, especially when you're taking a look at Texas, because Texas impacts the US and subsequently the rest of the world. So it's great. And if you have energy policies, man, I wish you would run for energy secretary. Holy smokes.
well, look, CCUS is just one tool,
right,
in the toolkit, and the toolkit ultimately is about meeting the dual challenge, right? And the dual challenge is to provide reliable and affordable energy to the world today.
Yep.
Simultaneously aggressively driving down CO2 emissions.
Right.
And doing one without doing the other is not good enough, right? And so I think most people who've studied those challenges closely would agree that there's no real path to net zero that does not include CCUS in a major way. It can't be the only tool. Look, there are a lot of places in the world that have no place to store captured carbon. Right. So we're lucky here in Texas. We've got great geology, both offshore and onshore, that allow us to do it. But there are a lot of places in the world that don't have that. So CCUS can't be the only tool in driving down emissions, but it can be a really valuable and important one, particularly here in Texas, where we have a lot of the pieces in place that will allow us to do it. So we think it's really important that the world buy into this, that Texas buy into it, that our policymakers buy into it. that we become a real leader in this technology, because if we are, it'll make us a leader in driving down CO2 emissions, and it will also still make for a healthy fossil fuel industry that we need to have to meet the world's current energy demands.
Oh, excellent points. It seems like, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I have to fact check myself all the time, especially my wife tells me that, hey, go fact check yourself. But when we sit back and take a look at Occidental, they seem like they're leading the charge. And again, I have to check, but the CEO, she was sitting there saying it's a multi-billion-dollar, trillion-dollar industry, and they're, in my opinion, I think leading the charge in that.
Yeah, Oxy is definitely out in front on this, but a bunch of other companies are quite involved as well. And ExxonMobil has put together a consortium of 14 different companies around the Houston Ship Channel, power companies, petrochem companies, and others who are working on a $100 billion CCUS project. $100 billion, make it the largest project in the world by a very long shot, if it can ultimately get done. And they're in the FEED study stage right now on that project. So Oxy's showing great leadership there, as are a lot of the other kind of major oil companies and petrochem companies as well.
That's cool. Now, Sean Strawbridge is also on the board down at the Port of Corpus Christi. And boy, we're exporting LNG at every possible moment that we can.
Yeah.
Do you see it, CO2 or carbon capture being a commodity you pump out? Because it's used in different things.
Well, it is used, right now, we would not have, if we were doing carbon capture on a really, really large scale. Right now, we don't have enough economic uses for that captured CO2 to turn it into things with economic value. The hope, and so most of it would just get stored underground. Hope and desire is that as material science develops, we can take that captured CO2 and use it in a whole range of things that have economic value. And if we can do that, it's obviously going to drive down the break-even costs of doing these very large CCUS projects. But there's really interesting work going on in our universities and within our companies around using that captured CO2 in new materials.
That Chuck over, I believe it's the University of Houston. He is just I was on a panel with him on a large investor conference, and he's one of the board members from the Carbon Neutral Coalition. He is a sharp cat.
Yeah, Chuck is, absolutely, and he's a big advocate for CCUS and doing a really good job.
Well, and you're right. And when we win by having the universities find those things, but how do you feel about the investing in the carbon, like Oxy did go out and have the carbon neutral shipment of oil going out. And I think that's huge. But you take a look at buying the tax credits and those kind of things. How do you think that market will affect CCUS?
Well, hopefully it'll be kind of wind in the sails, in a good way, because look, investors and companies all over the world are constantly paying more and more attention to the carbon intensity of the fossil fuels that they're buying. And that's also showing up in the LNG business, increasingly, the buyers of that LNG, in Asia or Europe or wherever we're shipping it to from Corpus Christi and in Houston and Sabine Pass, the buyers of that LNG want to know what the carbon footprint is of the LNG that they're buying. And so increasingly, the ability of the producers and transporters and liquefiers of that natural gas, increasingly they're going to need to prove that they're doing it cleanly. And the other thing that's clear is is buyers are actually willing to pay a little bit more
Right.
for cleaner forms of it.
Right.
And so there's an incentive for the whole value chain to be working towards that end.
You sit back and you think about what there's a couple things that the ESG movement has done for the oil and gas industry. And I was very pleased to see over the last few years that the Texas EMP operators did help clean up their flaring, almost voluntarily. But then the regulations came in from the Texas Railroad Commission, and they helped out. And then the Bitcoin miners really helped out by putting, Bitcoin mining everywhere. I'm impressed that the ESG movement started that in the oil and gas. But now we're seeing that there's a move away from ESG investing because of the potential of the recession coming up. Do you think that?
Look, ESG investing per se is still in the relatively, early days.
Okay.
I think what is clear is
Yep.
that whether it's ESG investors per se, or just,
Right.
your average, mutual fund, or, a doctor or dentist who has money in the
Right.
stock market, when they invest in energy companies or in any company,
Right.
they want that company to be focused on what its own CO2 footprint is,
Right.
and how are they going to get it down.
Right.
Right. And so, even the energy companies here in Texas who aren't, investing in or playing in the whole energy transition space per se, say you're just a normal upstream oil and gas producer in Midland.
Right.
Every one of those guys is also focused on their own CO2 emissions footprint and getting it down.
Yep.
And I give a lot of credit to the ESG community. And look, we can complain all we want about, how environmentalists don't understand the oil and gas business.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, without some pushing from the outside, we wouldn't have the whole industry focused on lowering its CO2 footprint. So
I agree.
I think there's value in that. But that world also needs to understand that we're trying to meet a dual challenge, right? We're trying to lower our CO2 footprint, and we're also trying to provide reliable and affordable energy to the world today.
Right.
And we have to do both of those things, and we have to do them simultaneously. And therein lies the challenge.
And that's a tough one, because I firmly believe that we need to provide the lowest cost kilowatt per hour to all citizens of the world, with the least amount of impact on the environment. And you got to have fossil fuels to do that before you can transfer over here. And I don't care if we use wind, solar, nuclear, it doesn't matter. Let's take care of humanity and elevate them out of poverty.
Yeah.
And that to me sounds, and this adds up another thing. I was reading in your information is that you're focusing in Houston on making it the most financial capital of the world for renewables and everything else. So tell us about that.
Well, we call it the HETI, HETI, the Houston Energy Transition Initiative.
Okay.
It's an initiative of the Greater Houston Partnership. The Greater Houston Partnership is think of it as the Chamber of Commerce for Houston, for our region. And the idea here is that we need our Houston business community, in particular our incumbent energy community, focused on being a partner and a connector and a real meaningful player in how the energy world is going to evolve over time. And in particular, in meeting these dual challenges of driving down CO2 emissions and providing reliable and affordable energy today. I think what's clear is there will not be success in driving down CO2 emissions globally without massive participation from the incumbent oil and gas industry. It is not going to happen without participation from the oil and gas industry. So our desire at HETI has been to kind of rally the troops, if you will, and get us focused on it as a region. it's also just purely an economic matter for the state of Texas and certainly for
Right.
the Houston region, right? A lot of our jobs and activity is tied to this industry. And we need to, when we look up a decade from now and 2 decades from now, we want to still be the energy capital of the world.
Right.
But we know that energy markets are going to look meaningfully different 2 decades from now because of this need to drive down CO2 emissions dramatically. So
Right.
the question becomes, well, how do we in Houston take advantage of our sort of strategic advantages,
Right.
if you will, to make sure that we're a leader in the space and doing our part in helping to make this transition one that meets both of those goals. And so that's what HEDI is. We have all of our big companies involved in this and enthusiastic about it. There's a ton of kind of innovation and entrepreneurship happening in the space in Houston. Our academic institutions, Rice, A&M, U of H, UT are all involved in a really positive way with research and development and support.
Right.
So there's just a lot happening in the space, and we're right in the middle of it here in Houston, Texas, which we ought to be.
You know, Houston is always known as the oil capital of the world, you know, for the United States and everything else. And I love this transition to, because it's a transition of energy, transition of Houston into that from the financial aspect. This is huge, Bobby.
Yeah, no, it's big and it's important. And look, money tends to go where the opportunity is and where the management talent is. And that's why, look, that's why Houston has historically been the world capital of the fossil fuel world, is that this is where the intellectual capital sat, right? This is where the brain power sat. And we need to make sure that's also the case as energy markets develop and morph into new things over time. Right. So we got to attract that talent. A lot of it is going to come out of our incumbent industry. Some of it's going to come from new places. But you know, we have here in Houston so many of the pieces in place that are a big kind of starting point advantage for us relative to any other major metro, certainly in the United States.
Right.
And we need to make sure we don't blow it. Right. We don't want to look up 10 or 20 years from now and say, uh-oh, you know, we're the Detroit of the energy business, right? No, or we're the Charleston, West Virginia, which was the coal capital of the world.
Right.
Now it's a ghost town because, you know, coal demand has fallen off the cliff and they didn't have anything else going. So we're trying to get out in front of that, and our companies and our political leadership and our average citizens are very much on board with all that. Yep. And we have a responsibility, right? It's a big challenge that the world is facing, dual challenge, and it's not going to get solved without us. Right. And so we have a responsibility to be leaning into it, and that's exactly what we're doing.
When you sit back and take a look, this is all very, very way cool. Especially with considering how many people, there's a couple things going for Texas. I love having Texas license plates. I suddenly feel smarter when I go across the border from Oklahoma into Texas. I don't know how.
Well, I'm from Louisiana, so I'm glad you said Oklahoma and not Louisiana.
The interview is now over. No, it's Louisiana has its own things going on. Oklahoma, its pavement is just drying on its runways. People think that we're backwards up here, but well, we are. But I'm kidding. I could say that. I graduated from Oklahoma State, love it. But when we sit back, you're better to be good, lucky than good, or your old philosophy is working now for this city of Houston and bringing all of that financial goodness also with the Carbon Coalition is fantastic. And so that's pretty darn cool to have your leadership rolling off into those other things.
Yeah, like our there's a long history of business leadership in public affairs, and certainly in Houston and in Texas more broadly. And our business leadership really does believe that these are challenges that are not likely to get solved by the public
Right.
sector. They're ultimately going to get solved by the private sector. We need public sector participation,
Right.
and leadership and involvement and support, but the solutions are likely to come from the private sector. And we believe that to be true, and that's what we're working.
And when we take a look at regulations, how, you take a look at the geopolitical disaster going on in Europe. I mean, it's a disaster of biblical proportions, if you would. And we may be running down that same road without a plan of going to carbon neutral in an organized fashion.
Right, right.
Texas
So
had,
I think that in some sense, what's happened in Europe here, not just in Europe, but globally in the last 6 months, has been a very healthy wake-up call
yes,
for people in this country, in the sense that it's reminded everyone of how critically important energy systems are to their everyday life.
right,
That their world stops without effectively functioning energy systems, and that the cost of that energy also really matters.
right,
And so it's been a wake-up call, I think, particularly for people who have been advocates of stopping investment in the current incumbent oil and
Right.
gas world. We are not yet in a position where we can do that.
right,
Doing that would cause enormous hardship. It would cause death and disaster all over the world.
right,
Yet at the same time, we can't lose our sense of urgency around driving down CO2 emissions.
right.
And so the question becomes, how do we do both at the same time? We gotta look, as my high school coach used to say, you gotta be able to walk and chew gum, right? And that's where we are here. And it's expensive, it's technically difficult, and it's going to take all of us, really working together to make that happen. I actually think the whole conversation around it is in a healthier place today than it was pre the Ukraine invasion and the current energy crisis in Europe, because I think it's kind of recentered people around, okay, we got to do both of these things. We can't just focus on CO2 emission declines,
Right.
without also having a healthy current energy system today that can supply reliable and affordable energy to the world. So I think that's the case, but we got to work it. We got to work it every day.
Grant Omaker, one of my old bosses 20 years ago or something like that, said, focus on everything now. And I think that's what we ought to do, is focus on everything now. I don't always like that. But let's take a look at, because refineries are a real problem. The last big one that we did was 1978, I believe. And then it's been all the little ones since then. And a lot of refineries over in the Louisiana area, and the regulations are different. And this is teeing up for a question for both the Houston and the carbon neutral. What can we do to get rid of some of those regulations to help get newer refineries built? Because if we put the new technology on refineries, that's going to be part of the oil and gas industry right there on the new refineries, and helping reduce that. But it's all regulation based. How can that?
And that's why groups like the Carbon Neutral Coalition and HEDI are really important here, because policy does matter. The energy world is a highly regulated world,
right?
And it needs to be regulated, but it has to be done in a simple way that will allow new assets, cleaner assets, better assets to get built. And if we have this kind of national NIMBY, not in my backyard problem when it comes to refining and petrochemical and that business, then we're going to have a hard time driving down our CO2 emissions, but because those businesses will just they will get pushed to dirtier and dirtier places and be used on old equipment. So look, another part of our challenge is that our refining industry hasn't caught up with the shale revolution that happened in this country, right? So
Yes.
it's important to remember that the United States is both the world's largest exporter of oil today, and we're the world's largest importer of oil today. Right. And you say, well, that doesn't make sense. Why? And the answer is because our refineries are actually not enough of them are configured to process this lighter, sweeter crude that is coming out of the Permian Basin now in such size. And you know, a lot of our refineries are configured to process the heavier grades that come from Venezuela and Mexico and other places. Right. So part of what needs to happen is the reconfiguration of our own refining and petrochem system.
Doesn't that kind of
that takes capital? Sorry. It takes capital, and it takes kind of regulatory help to do that, and we need both of those things.
Doesn't that kind of fit in with my comment?
It does, absolutely.
So, you know, we sit back and we go, we got leader. I'll tell you, one of the other things I thought was really, really cool was the big oil executives last month when they were getting beat up testifying in front of Congress. I found it offensive that they were getting beat up that badly, saying one of the congressmen was saying, will you increase production and sacrifice giving money back to the investors? And it was a yes or no, and he wouldn't let him answer. But without a single one, they all snuck it in and said, we will increase production and we will give more money back to our investors. And that's because they are making the commitments to the ESG. The investors want their investors back. Yeah. But man, I'm proud of the U.S. oil companies sticking up and giving money back to the investors.
Yeah, look, investors are demanding it. You know, I mean, the thing you got to remember about the energy business is it's highly, highly capital intensive.
Yes.
And, you know, the folks who provide the money have a lot to say about it. Right. And so the folks who run the energy companies don't operate in a vacuum, right? They've got their capital providers to answer to,
right?
And the capital providers are very clear about what they want, right? They want relatively less growth, but more free cash flow generation and cleaner operations. That's what they want. And so we are going to get some growth out of the industry for sure. But the capital providers do not want this unbridled focus on top line growth like we had in the shale revolution from 2008 to 2018 at the expense of profitability and cash flow generation. And because if the companies do that, they're not getting any more money. They'll go out of business. Right. And so it's very clear what the capital providers want. And so the companies are having to live within that framework.
You know, I just enjoy talking with you because you've got so much, a wide breadth of knowledge on all this kind of stuff. And when you sit back and take a look, what would you tell folks? Because the big oil companies were using their profits to fund their renewable sides of the business and trying to go in that route. Like we talked about, Oxy was actually leading the charge of making money, you know, off tax credits and going, so that their business model was tapping into that.
Yeah.
But we're not getting enough capital back into oil companies to even keep up with normal decline curves. And then the inflation, my head hurts with trying to figure out pricing, you know, where are we going to be with oil and everything else? Right. But what would you tell people, oil executives, that investors want their money back, but like Chevron just put out that they're only going to put back 14%, whatever the number was, they were only going to increase their CapEx spending by 14%. But yet you have a 50% increase in drilling costs. So it's actually going to not be an increase, but it's going to be barely keeping up.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on where we're going with the pricing on this? It's a complex mess.
Running an oil company is not an easy job. Okay, you are subject to a lot of things out of control.
Right.
And most importantly, you're subject ultimately to the commodity price.
Right.
And notwithstanding what many of our congressional leaders think, major oil companies don't control the oil price, right? They are price takers. They are not price makers.
Right.
And it's within that context that they have to plan their capital program, and they have to take a long-term view, right? A lot of these projects literally take decades to make happen. And so, when you are allocating capital to these big projects, you have to make assumptions about commodity price. You have to make assumptions about drilling and services costs. You have to make assumptions about the regulatory regimes where you're operating. It is a big, complicated capital allocation business. Part of the reason that a lot of these companies have sort of redirected more of their capital towards the U.S. shale business and the Permian Basin in particular, is that it's much shorter cycle stuff, right? You don't need to plan 10 years ahead of time. You need to plan about 6 months ahead of time. But you're still subject to price volatility, and you're still subject to cost volatility. And so, look, the guys who run, men and women who run these companies are just making those capital allocation decisions every day and trying to do it in a way that they can produce returns for their shareholders that are greater than their cost of capital, right? Only in that way are you creating economic value, and that's their charge as managers, to create economic value. At the same time, the world wants them to drive down CO2 emissions. And one of the, we spoke early about kind of the broad conversation around energy transition and how it's probably a little healthier today. One area where we need to catch up in that conversation is we need more focus on the demand side of the equation, right? All the focus tends to be on the supply side. How do we change the supply of energy to the world, as opposed to how do we affect demand in the world? And the reason for that is that the politics around supply are a lot easier than the politics around demand, right? Because when you start talking about the politics around demand, you're asking individuals to make hard choices, right? And sometimes you're asking them to pay more, right? Sometimes you're asking them to use less, so, and no one wants to do that, right? They want ExxonMobil and Chevron and BP to solve their problem for them. Right. And ultimately, this is not a problem that ExxonMobil and BP and Chevron can solve in a vacuum, right? It's going to take everybody pulling together all around the world to make this happen. And that includes the consumers, not just the producers.
You bring up a fantastic point. In fact, I was chuckling because the nobbies or newbies, the not in my backyard folks, but they're also the I'm not going to turn down my thermostat. So we got to figure out the thing on that. The EU is mandating Germany's saying take shorter showers, and everybody's laughing in Europe going, not me.
Right.
You bring up a great point. Nobody's going to want to cut the
politics around demand are not good politics. So you'll notice when gasoline prices go up to $6 a share, there's not a single politician telling one of their voters, well, you just need to drive less, or quit driving your Suburban, or why don't you carpool? No one's telling them that. They just haul up the oil companies in front of Congress and say, why are you gouging our consumers, right? So the politics around demand are a lot more difficult than the politics around supply, which is why all the focus gets
those are all fantastic points, Bobby. That is just unbelievably funny, because nobody's going to turn up the thermostat during the summer. Oh, who was it? Was it Harold Hamm that said that last summer? If you want to solve the energy problem, turn up your thermostat. Right. I thought that was a great line. But so now now that we've solved the world's problems, you're a industry leader, leading the charge on these kind of things. What is Artemis going to be doing next? What are your plans with that? We've talked about how you're influencing the energy market with your other organizations. What's next around the corner for
Well, our Artemis will be investing in startup companies and energy companies of all sorts.
Nice.
Some of that focuses on transition related companies. Some of it's on the incumbent industry. Okay. But it'll be focused on investing. You know what I said in my speech is we have both a responsibility and an opportunity associated with all this, right? There's money to be made. And you know, one thing we tend to be good at in Houston, Texas is if we see a dollar bill lying on the ground, we bend over and pick it up. There's a lot of that related to the opportunity of the energy transition. So at Artemis, I'll be focused on those situations and those companies. Yep. and finding places to invest that are attractive.
I get lots of questions, Bobby, from accredited investors and institutional investors, because we do a lot of market research at Sandstone. What would you tell folks about the investing side of oil and gas right now? We're coming into tax season, and it seems like everybody's looking for a tax deduction because taxes could go up. You know, got to pay for the debt somehow. But what would you tell folks to look for alternative investments?
Look, I think the energy sector, broadly defined, is a really interesting place to invest.
Right.
It's not without its issues.
Right.
Right. I have a friend who says every 15 years or so, the Saudis have to remind everyone who's boss. And we've gone through a bit of that as well. And when you're investing in the energy world, getting the timing of the cycle right tends to be important. Right. The business is pretty healthy right now, right? It's right. Generating cash. We have high commodity prices, but I would argue that the prices of the companies reflect long-term commodity prices that are meaningfully lower than we have today. So right. You don't have to have $95 WTI and $6 natural gas forever and ever for energy companies to be interesting places to invest. So right. I think the incumbent industry is an interesting place to invest. And I think there are a lot of new companies that are being formed to, in some cases, to kind of tie the incumbent industry to the needs of the transition. In yep. some cases, it's truly kind of whiz bang, all new stuff. But there's just a ton of activity going on in the space right now that makes for interesting places to invest. But like any and all investments, not everything's going to go up, and yep. trees don't grow to the sky, right? And so you gotta keep that in mind when you're investing in the energy sector, for sure.
Well, I'll tell you what, Bobby, thank you so much for your time today. I just really appreciated your time. And more importantly, I love what you're doing for Texas, the coalition, and for Houston. Those are all big things. And I just want to let you know that it's being noticed and appreciated. So thank you.
Thank you, Stu. And thanks for the good work Sandstone's doing. And I've enjoyed being with you.
Oh, well, how do people get in touch with you? Because, you've got so many things that you've got driving right now. What's the best way for folks to get in touch with you?
Well, the best way is through the Houston Energy Transition Initiative. Okay. And so if you go to the website of the Greater Houston Partnership, you can click through to HEDI. Okay. And you can get to me through HEDI. I chair that committee for the partnership, and that's the easiest way to do it.
Sounds great. I'll make sure that's in the show notes. So thank you very much.
Good deal. Thank you.